Greetings all, Pooka here. Just a quick note before we start this episode that our guest and I both had connectivity issues and consequent audio issues while recording this. I've cleaned things up as best as I can, but you may hear some variation in the sound quality throughout the episode. I hope it won't be too distracting, and with that, on with the show.
This is Changeling the Podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the Podcast. Come for the glamour, stay for the vibes. I'm your host Pooka, and today I am joined by special guest and extra special LARP correspondent Amanda. Welcome.
Greetings.
So thanks for joining me, because as someone who is very dedicated to Changeling the Dreaming, has done LARP once in a while, I have still yet to actually do a Changeling the Dreaming LARP game. So I'm trusting in your experience today as we talk about Mind's Eye Theater Changeling.
Excellent. I will try to be worthy of that trust.
Hooray! For clarity, this is not the Shining Host or the Shining Host Player's Guide, nor is this any kind of official book that was released as part of the Changeling 20th lineup. This is a product by Night Studios, who is the official World of Darkness LARP producer for Paradox now. But there's some kind of history that I'm not clear on.
There is, yes. To put it briefly, By Night Studios spun off, began with their Vampire the Masquerade update, which was a completely different take on the LARP rules. It was not Laws of the Night, but its own completely different thing. They followed that up with a Werewolf doing the same thing. They were going to follow up with Changeling. However, let's just say there were unpleasant allegations as involving one of the main owners of My Night Studios, and he lost all of his backing. And the company was bought out by a group of LARPers who were associated with Mind's Eye Society LARP Club that was formerly the Camarilla. And they bought By Night Studios, put Changeling the Dreaming back into development, crowdfunded getting the book together, and this is what the result was.
So the people who are currently By Night Studios affiliated with Paradox are not the same ones as these, or they are?
The controlling elements are not the same. I don't know if there are individual people that stayed on or not. I can't address that, but the controlling elements are different.
Because I do recognize a couple of the names in the credits just from people who have worked on Changeling elsewhere. I see Cynthia Marie, who's well known for doing LA by Night and all of that stuff in association with Paradox. Right. But something else that I notice just as I open this PDF with truly a beautiful cover, I have to admit.
Yes.
There's a lot of Instagram handles and Twitch URLs and things like that. And I guess my question here, let me first ask, can you talk a little bit about your history with LARPing and Changeling?
All right. Well, I began to LARP in 2001 and have been doing so pretty steadily ever since. Unlike some of your other LARP guests, my LARP experience has been exclusively with large form organized play, long-running campaigns. I've never been involved with a troop LARP or a Nordic LARP or any of those others. So everything that my critique of this book covers is coming from that perspective. A lot of what I'm going to have to say could probably be fixed with house rules, that sort of thing, in a small environment. But that's not the environment that I'm coming from.
So do you think that the feel of LARPing has changed at all in the time that you've been doing it? I bring up the URLs and stuff because my sense is that now that we live in an era of streaming, that I imagine kind of changes. Maybe people who would have been drawn towards LARP are now more I'm going to do an actual play instead. So I don't know, maybe because we're living in an age of internet celebrity, does that kind of affect things?
I would have said no prior to COVID. If anything has changed LARP, it's COVID. It's not streaming culture or the availability of online play. It was COVID that pretty much fundamentally altered what it is to LARP.
Makes
Uh,
sense. Yeah.
yes, at this point now, people have moved a great deal to online play over Discord or over streaming, and somehow still consider that to be LARP, which personally I don't agree with. But hey, if that's what makes people happy and keeps them in the hobby, so be it.
I accept this. Not
Exactly.
necessarily happily, but I accept it.
I accept it. I don't agree with it.
Let's turn some pages because this book is large.
Oh, it is. It's
Fair
dense.
warning. Yeah, it is nearly 400 pages. Certainly the longest Changeling book on the site.
And at the same
So,
time, it is barely half the size of the same by Night Studios as Werewolf Offering.
oh Lord. Well, so getting into it, I'm going to try and fly through these chapters as quickly as possible. And I know you have critiques along the way, so let's stop me if anything occurs to you.
Absolutely.
So we open with a dramatic scene in which she sacrifices herself to stop a massive wave of banality from extinguishing the kingdom of grass. Apparently she's the queen and her brother's the king. I'm going to just kind of skip over that. It's very cinematic and emotional and whatnot. I assume these were all characters in someone's game, but it gives us the first hint of something that we'll get into in really chapter 2, which is the setting changes that have happened here. Yeah, it's a very this is winter kind of take on Changeling. It has arrived, bad things are everywhere, Shadow Court is in power. We'll get more into the details of that, but it definitely sets the tone. I'll say that for it.
It does. I very much enjoyed all of the fiction in here, some more than others, but there was none of the fiction that really turned me off.
Yeah.
And this definitely set the tone of what we're going to expect moving forward.
Yeah. In the chapter 1 introduction, this is very much written, I think, with the assumption that the reader has neither played Changeling nor Mind's Eye Theater, nor perhaps even role played before. I mean, most core books start that way, so some of it's probably pretty necessary. Like, it's good to talk about what the World of Darkness entails. And I like their notes on the aesthetic of like dark realism, but it gets a little excessive maybe when they're like, what is a character? But then they have this list of golden rules,
Mm-hmm.
and I wanted to ask you, are these familiar? Are any of these new? Has this always been the Mind's Eye Theater core commandments?
These are mostly familiar. They've got a little bit of updates to them, and there have been a couple of really nice additions. For the most part, I'm very pleased with what they've done here. You can find the kernel of these Mind's Eye rules in all of the older versions of the LARP material. The no touching, the no stunting, the no real weapons, that kind of
Mm.
thing. All of those are to be expected. I do like that they changed from a flat out denial of any sort of intoxicating substances to a stay alert and in
Mm.
control.
Yeah, yeah.
It's moved with the times and I appreciate it. People are much more mindful of their own limitations and their own comfort level. And let's face it, we're adults. If we choose to partake in a minor fashion, we should be able to do that as long as we're still in control. And I particularly approve, though, they've added don't scare the normies. Good choice. That's been a problem.
We also get these notes about things like be polite and manage your bleed,
Mm-hmm.
inclusion, the rules should support the story. Like all of this, I think, is sensible advice. And we're off to a good start. I'll admit that.
I agree. So far, so good. Very pleasantly surprised.
Yes. We then get the big list of lexicon. One thing that did bug me was that there are like editing errors and typos throughout this whole book.
Oh,
Um,
goodness, yes. This needed another pass.
I have some level of forgiveness when it comes to like foreign language terms, but when they start talking about the recap kith, I'm like, ugh.
Yeah. Or when Pooka is spelled 3 different ways.
On the same page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they definitely needed another editorial pass on this.
Yes. So then at the end of the introduction, we get some developers' notes. And this is, I guess, their meta commentary on how they are positioning this book in relation to previous Mind's Eye Theater Changeling stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So very quickly, I'm just going to read these out. First, the setting for this game is Endless Winter. Second, dual legacy archetypes no longer exist. Third, we added the Piskies. Fourth, we added the Selkies. 5, we removed the Inanime as a playable character type. 6, we streamlined powers to be thematic. 7, banality and temporary banality are now known as ennui and are mechanically outlined in more depth. 8, Chimerical death no longer exists and changelings no longer reincarnate. 9. A new scale for banality and bedlam is included to reflect the balancing act required to maintain a mortal life and a changeling soul. 10. Some creatures have brief write-ups but may be explored in future projects. 11. Nunyihi are not included in this book. How do you feel about these?
Such a blend of really good choices and really bad and even occasionally cowardly choices, I would say.
That about sums it up.
Mm-hmm.
I think 8 was the one that made my head spin around. It's like,
Definitely. Add to that, I mean, they added the Piskies and the Selkies. The Piskies and the Selkies were added in Shining Host. There's nothing new here.
That's what I thought. I was like, I remember them being in there. But...
Mm-hmm. And I understand being cautious and sensitive about handling the Nunnehi. No matter how well they've been handled, they've, in my opinion, never been handled well enough. I understand that. But still, not even trying seems like they really missed an opportunity.
And the other thing is that they are included in the book because I did do a Control F and searched for it, and there's a couple, oblique references, and they're presented very much in line with their like first edition selves, where it's just really awful. So
exactly, worst of both worlds, really.
Yeah.
Plus, I mean, they hold out hope with the some creatures have brief write-ups and may be explored in future projects. There are no future projects. There almost certainly will not be.
Yeah, it's been 4 years. I don't know that there's going to be.
Yeah.
And then we get some more beautiful art, though. So I don't know where they shot these photo shoots, but man,
I don't know either. Some of the art, I think, is really hit or miss. What's good is amazing. What's not really looks like it belongs in a vampire book.
I can accept this one, though. This is...
Oh, yes, this is a good one. And even the ones that belong in a vampire book, it's not bad art. It just doesn't fit.
Yeah. So then we get some more fiction about a Canadian Slua moving house. Seems to be a Shadow Court operative spreading the, I don't know, Gospel of Shadows or whatever. I had assumed like each chapter, because there are 12 chapters, so I thought each one would start with like a story from the perspective of a different kith. And then it didn't happen, which disappointed me.
It seems like a missed opportunity.
Yeah.
And I swear, the art that comes with that fiction piece, I swear I know that guy, but I can't put my finger on who he is.
There is a list of models on the credits page.
Yeah, but none of the names stuck out, so no. I have no idea.
Alas. So then chapter 2. They mention that they've drawn from canon material spanning decades, including graphic novels, which is news to me. I can't remember any Changeling graphic novels coming out, but I'd be happy.
Neither can I.
Yeah.
I even looked, and I'm not going to say that there are none, but I was not able to find any.
Maybe they're talking about that like cartoon that was in the second edition core book. I don't know.
Possibly.
They make this statement about how they've altered the history to make for a better live action game, which fine, depending how much and what precisely, but I don't know. I feel like that wouldn't help people cross over from LARP to tabletop and vice versa. And I don't know if it serves either mode of play to have them like siloed like that.
For all that the early sections of this book go out of its way to explain everything to complete newbies, I really don't believe that this book is intended for people to cross from tabletop to LARP.
Yeah.
I think this book is intended either for people who are already intimately familiar with LARP or are coming in completely blank slate.
Which, I mean, is disappointing. I would love to LARP, but I don't want to feel like, oh, you're going to actually have to learn an entirely new setting to do it correctly.
Exactly. I believe in the Shining Host episode, you or possibly Josh had made a comment that when you had new people interested in Changeling, you would hand them the Shining Host book and say, here's a quick and easy way to understand. This is not that book.
No, very not.
No.
So the broad strokes that we get here, setting-wise, they talk about the Dreaming and its layers. They talk about the Silver Path, Arcadia, Concordia. Most of that is the same, except that the kingdoms have been demoted, I think is the word they use. The courts and their codes are given, but they, along with the Parliament of Dreams, have been disbanded. Most of this is fine, except, I mean, putting aside whether or not the changes in the setting were a good idea, the way in which all of it is described, I think, holds together, except that Seelie and Unseelie feel very good and evil to me, very one-dimensional.
It seems to go back to 1E a lot.
Yeah. And I feel like the Shadow Court gets presented differently every time it's come up, and I hardly ever like it.
I agree, but by the same token, with it being the Shadow Court, it being completely different every time seems somehow vaguely appropriate.
What's frustrating, though, is that it was in the Shining Host Player's Guide that I think they had my favorite take on it.
I
And it was like,
agree.
that was already in the LARP. You could have just used that.
I agree, but from what I can gather, particularly with the folks who ended up actually developing BNS streaming, I think they went out of their way to not reference Shining Host or Shining Host Player's Guide.
Unfortunate.
I agree, because Shining Host, yes, it could definitely do with a new, like a revision, facelift, as it were, for the modern era, but it was a really good set of rules. It was very well done.
And this is very much not, well, we'll get to whether or not it's a good set of rules, but it is
Yes.
not a tight, streamlined document in the same way.
No. Not to mention, I'll just go ahead and mention one thing.
Yeah.
The entire purpose of the LARP line was to have the books be small enough to fit into a jacket pocket or a purse. This is the size of a full-size hardcover RPG textbook.
Yep. With much less art.
You could do damage attacking somebody with this book.
Yeah. So we get some of the history of the Cathane, which the terms are there. It rings familiar. They talk about the Sundering. They talk about the Great Unleashing, so tilts towards Dark Ages Fae that we also saw in C20, the War of Trees. There's a few, if not new ideas, at least more directly spelled out possibilities presented, like the true history. So the idea of the Fomorians coming first and ruling the world, all of that. It's a very C20 thing to present that as though that's the true history. Like it's always been kind of up in the air.
Agreed. There were tiny little hints of it throughout some of the deeper dives into the house books.
Yeah.
And a lot of Dark Ages. But that was something that I had in my notes, that it seems like they've taken a lot that was hinted and optional and made it fact.
The timelines are also weird, because if I'm reading this correctly, the Fomorians were worshipped by fish. That's how it reads, right? It's like the Fomorians bent all early life to their will. As time passed, gills gave way to lungs. It's like, oh, all right, they were fish gods.
Which, if you're going to go at it with the cosmic horror element of Fomorians, I guess, deep one, sure. But
why not?
Whatever. There are other things that I'm much more bothered by. Let's put it that way. I'll give that a pass.
I was bothered by the Sundering collapsing iron and Christianity and the Inquisition into like a single thing. Like there's a little bit more complexity there, but
just a little.
Just a bit.
Yeah. But by the same token, I am a little bit impressed that they, even with the changes that they made, they did get a relatively concise history into just a few pages.
It's true.
I still wouldn't hand this to a new player and say, here, learn about Changeling. But I've seen worse takes take longer.
And they certainly, if they haven't read the source material, this like the first and second edition books, they've at least skimmed the wiki, I guess, because there are Easter eggs in here, like the story about House Liam and the nunnery, the Redcap having monster hunters in the interregnum, all little things that are like throwaway references on random pages of those older books. And it's like, oh, hey.
Exactly. Yeah, if you're being charitable, they're Easter eggs. If you're being a little less charitable, these are in-jokes and, hey, look, we're part of the in-crowd and you're not.
Yeah, I guess that's also possible.
But then again, I tend to be a rather cynical and banal person, so take that with a grain of salt.
I would say those two things don't necessarily have to co-occur. I think it's totally fine to be cynical and glamorous. So we get the interregnum. We're told there was a focus on gathering dross and keeping freeholds going. The US apparently created the entire dream of democracy. We'll leave that to one side. And then the Resurgence and Accordance War write-ups are sort of a greatest hits of stuff we saw in Nobles the Shining Host, Fool's Luck, and War on Concordia. The major point of divergence with C20 is that we have the original Red Star plot here rather than the 9/11 based Evanescence, maybe to align better with Vampire and Werewolf. Then a massive wave of banality in 2000 that brought Endless Winter. The Fomorians awoke. High King David leads a quest into the dreaming that results in his death. And so the Shadow Court, led by Milga, takes charge. They step in. They're like, hey, we've got all this stockpile of glamour and dross, and all you have to do is put us in charge. So it's sort of in line with that one Time of Judgment scenario. But the chapter just kind of ends without really going into detail about how that transition unfolded. So when I read this, I'm like, well, wait a minute. how did everyone just say, okay? It's like, you really have to treat this as though the last 20 years, what we know about how the world has changed, how technology has evolved, how different forms of glamour and banality that we look at now, how all of that has unfolded. It's kind of like, no, you have to just accept that the world just stopped in the year 2000 and stayed as it was so that the Shadow Court could step in.
Exactly. And while part of that I can understand a little in that it's winter. Winter has overtones of stasis and a lack of change. So you could make that argument. But it also just seems very fait accompli, almost.
Yeah.
Not to mention they got rid of the entire abduction of High King David plotline, which is pretty major to the meta.
Yeah, it's like they retconned and then spun off.
Yes.
So,
And spun off, that's a major point. If this setting had been treated as an alternate universe, as a here's one option for what could be, I would adore what they've done.
Yeah.
It just doesn't feel like the Dreaming as we know it and love it and understand it.
And it's such a shame, I imagine, for people who LARPed from the time of The Shining Host until this book came out. And I imagine there was a lot of excitement when this book came out. And then to see this and be like,
There
it's
was.
unfortunate. Fait accompli, I think that you said. That was the phrase for it in this case.
Yes. It was, I think that it's just a matter of the developers decided that this was how the game was going to be now. And by purchasing the game and playing, you've agreed that this is how it is. It's like accepting the terms and conditions on a user agreement.
The question that I have, I mean, this notion of, oh, the Shadow Court had all this draw saved up. I'm like, well, what about all the Fae who have the Dreamers background? Are there just no Dreamers anymore? And then it made me think, how have mortals been handled here, if at all?
And that's a lovely question. It would be nice if it was answered.
It would, wouldn't it?
Yeah. I mean, the Dreamers background is still there. And they did a remarkable job with Canaan.
Yeah.
But mortals, not really present.
Well, instead of answers, we instead get another piece of fiction. We're in an ancient and powerful fear murder beast that a Shadow Court she-lady rouses, goes and eats her child rival. And they're really just leading into the whole grandiose nightmare stuff, which I'm okay with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as far as this fiction, this is probably my favorite piece of fiction in the entire book. I don't know why, but I really like Hi-Hat.
Yeah, it's great. I just wish you weren't a Nunyahi because it just adds into that whole thing again.
True. Though, depending on how you read it or how closely you read it, you could easily miss the fact that he was a Nunyahi.
It's true. I mean, I only realized it later on when it referred to him as a rock giant, and I was like, oh man.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the first 2 or 3 times I read it, I was sure that he was a Slua or possibly like a Shochen. Is that it?
Oh, Shochen, yeah.
That, yes.
It has become my designated role to say that word on this podcast.
Indeed, and you have performed it well.
Huzzah! I'll let our Irish listeners determine that. But.
Well.
Oh, speaking of Ireland, we get a William Butler Yeats quote to open chapter 3, Kiths.
Yes.
So each Kith has quite the write-up here.
Mm-hmm.
Each one gets some historical and cultural context, definitely with the idea that Kiths are catch-alls for similar groups worldwide thing. Mm-hmm. There are notes on how they operate amongst themselves and within the society of Endless Winterland. There's talk about progress through their seemings, which I want to return to in the future.
Yeah.
Their distribution among courts and titles, their societies, their appearance, the mechanical stuff. Like all of this, I think is good. I think it's good that it's extensive because if this is a player's only resource for LARP Changeling, they're getting a lot of what would be in Kithbook material. I don't always agree with it, but spending word count on it is good.
Exactly. Although there is the one glaring omission.
Which one?
The total lack of birthrights.
Ah, yes.
And what was done with the birthrights?
Well, there's a form benefit, which is kind of a birthright.
Sure. Tell yourself that.
So is there like a reason for that? I couldn't remember how it was handled in Shining Host in terms of birthrights frailties.
Shining Host, the birthrights were adjusted for LARP because, of course, some of them just don't, I mean, like Pete was saying in his episode, some things just work very well in tabletop and have to change for LARP. But still, you got your birthrights in Shining Host. There wasn't a problem with that. This, they've made the birthrights into merits. So if you want to actually be what it means to be your kith, you have to take those merits. And merits are the single most scarce resource in the game.
Yeah. It's like wholly capped at 7, right? Like there's no getting around it. And you have to spend, like, if you want to play a she, you have to spend merit points.
Yes, and with them being hard capped at 7 points worth of merits, and each of the set of birthrights, there are 3 birthright merits for each kith, which total up together to be 6 of your 7 merit points. So if you want to actually be your kith, when you go to make your Pooka, if you want to actually shape change, it's going to take most of your merit points to even be able to be a proper Pooka.
Yeah. And the form benefits that they leave in as kind of like the skill bonus birthright, that's all of a kind, but then the frailties are really uneven, it feels like. The Boggin one is like incredibly punishing. So
yeah, game balance, or at least mechanical balance, is an ongoing problematic theme throughout this book.
So can we pivot to talk a little bit about your experience with playtesting this?
Sure.
How did that go?
Well, like I said earlier, the folks who bought By Night Studios were heavily involved with the Mind's Eye Society LARP group, which used to be the Camarilla, which was White Wolf's official fan club back in the day. Mm-hmm. It's one of the largest organized play LARPs ever, really, at least in terms of parlor LARP. So because most, if not all, of the new owners and developers for Dreaming were Mind's Eye Society players, there's heavy enmeshment between the two groups.
Okay.
And Mind's Eye Society was called upon to do a lot of the play testing. We were given the alpha slice and the beta slice of the rules, the same way that we had been given with the previous set of BNS with Vampire and Werewolf. And then with the assistance of the BNS people, we were given a package of scenarios that we could play like a play test in order to make use and understand these new rules and how they work. Mm-hmm. And it was really well done in that the BNS book starts with David having sallied forth into the deep dreaming and died. Well, our playtest, those scenario packets were those final battles. And that part, at least, was really exciting and very well done. But it also greatly pointed out where the rules were lacking. And some people's feedback was taken into account. And let's just say that they were looking for very specific feedback. And they took the feedback that they liked, and they ignored the feedback that did not mesh with what they were already going to do.
Can I ask also when this was? Because in the credits, they make reference to a 2018 think tank and a 2020 think tank. And I assume those were focus group sessions or whatever. But was your experience before, between?
It's my understanding that the 2018 think tank was with the original owners and developers, because they had begun the process of doing Dreaming. And then the change of ownership took place, and Dreaming had been shelved, and the 2020 was the reboot. And I was involved with the latter elements of it. I wasn't involved with the earlier stages.
Okay. It makes me wonder what it was like before the reboot.
Well, I still have the alpha slice document, and there were anonymous, but there weren't red caps in it.
Interesting.
Now, of course, an alpha slice is typically a vertical slice, so it's not going to give you all the kiths, all the powers, all the. Still, what it did give, a lot of that didn't make it into the final cut.
Just a couple other things here, too, though. Like, there's some interesting interpretations of the kiths. Mm-hmm. Like, they have the Cluricon as being born from the dreams of contracts or something, and I'm like, okay. Piskies. So the origin of the Piskies as being the human souls displaced by she. Yeah. I actually don't hate that as an origin for the Nevers, and I would have liked to see maybe a more explicit connection there if they were going to go with that. But taking the trickster role away from the Pooka and giving it to the Piskies, I'm like, how very dare you?
Exactly. Again, if I look at this entire BNS book as an alternate universe take, I'm a lot happier.
Yeah.
I find a lot of what they did with the Piskies satisfying on an emotional level, but on the other hand, it's not in accordance with the rest of Changeling.
Yeah. And then we have the seemings. So, correct me if I'm wrong. This was not in the original Shining Host stuff, correct?
It was not. The original Shining Host still just had the 3 seemings of Childling, Wilder, and Grump.
Okay. Because here it seems like, I mean, putting aside even people with C20, people seem to be very into, as we've discussed before on the show, the fluidity of seemings. Like you can be a Wilder at any age, you can go from Wilder to Childling, etc. They've not only moved away from that, but now the linear progression is tied to not necessarily your physical age, but like your status and your time LARPing, I guess.
Yes.
And it's a background.
It is. In a sense, I do understand that some things have to change with tabletop to LARP, in that it can be viable to do a tabletop wherein your adult player is playing a child. And that doesn't have to be weird, but it gets a lot weirder when you're a 25-year-old man pretending to be a 12-year-old boy.
Fair.
Doubly so since, again, the folks who were developing the BNS Changeling book were all part of the Mind's Eye Society, and Mind's Eye Society has a rule that says you're not allowed to portray a character who's below the age of either 16 or 18. I think it's 18, but it might have been 16.
It's 16 in this book because they say later changelings only awaken after age 16.
There you go then. Yeah. I've been out of the club long enough that some of those details have blurred for me. Yeah. So even though I don't really like it, I do understand, okay, the seemings have to change if players aren't allowed to basically be childlings.
It's really just, I mean, to me, it seems like a very gamified way of approaching life cycle and changeling. Like it's not about here's what it means to be a Wilder or whatever the other terms are they use here, foundling, etc. It's like you're level 1. Now you're going to get to level 2, and it just feels much less meaningful to me that way.
Agreed, especially when there's a paragraph when we get to the art section that was regularly overlooked, but ultimately just crippled the lower levels of seemings.
I'm wondering if I missed it in my like glazed eye read through of this 400-page monstrosity.
We'll see when we get there. Yeah.
Yes, but before we get there, we've got Chapter 4, Character Creation. Yes. Before talking about whether this is better or worse or unchanged from the character creation of Mind's Eye Theater Reviewer, some differences with C20. Instead of dual legacies, you get a single archetype, one of 42, which is interpreted through the lens of the court you choose. You get 30 XP to start. As a reminder, there's not really freebie points, there's just XP. And then you choose your kith and your court. Instead of 9 attributes, you have just physical, social, mental, and then the attributes like strength, charisma, etc. are focuses within each category. You get 4 skills at 4, 3, 2, and 1 dots to start, each of which has some little game system bonus. And then backgrounds, you choose 3, you get 3, 2, and 1 in them. To be a changeling, you must put at least 1 dot in the seeming background, and then you get 3 affinity arts depending on your kith, 2 dots, 1 dot, and 1 dot. You have an affinity realm. Realms don't have levels. We'll get to that next chapter. And then merits and flaws. So that's all of that. And I think I seem to recall something about there being more descriptive traits with the attributes. Like you weren't just charismatic, you might be like glib, or you might be engaging or something. And that was like a trait, right?
Right. In Shining Host, and for that matter, all of the other original LARP books, you had physical, social, and mental attributes, but they were all adjectives. Yeah. So you wouldn't be social enough to engage this power, you're friendly enough, or you're intimidating enough, and then somebody would have to call their own adjective to counter whatever it was that you were trying to do. I thought that it added a lot of flavor to use the adjectives, but this does streamline things a bit, and the loss of adjectives, it's a small loss. I mourn it, but I'm not going to complain about it too much.
Are there any other bits that particularly stand out as being radically different in either a good or bad way?
Well, the attribute focuses are new to the By Night Studios system, and if not for the fact that they're horrifically unbalanced, they would be really interesting.
Say more.
Well, Okay, so for each of the attributes, you get an attribute focus. You can choose strength, dex, or stamina, and for physical, and then the same for the social and the mental. Well, for the physicals, depending on whether you choose strength, dex, or stamina, you get to use combat maneuvers without cost, or you get a couple of other benefits, that sort of thing. They put a lot of thought into those choices for the physicals.
Yeah.
For the socials and the mentals, they just said, oh, well, you get a little bit of a bonus if your attribute matches. Add to that, too, depending on what kind of a character that you're playing, one of my major problems with the By Night Studios character creation system is that characters are siloed into their chosen niche.
Yes.
And it's very difficult to break out. Add to that, too, that if you're an experienced player, once you understand some very basic information about the people that you're playing with, you can pretty much just know what's on their sheet. And because of just the way that it's designed, LARP has a much stronger PvP element than tabletop does. And so if I know, okay, you're a relatively experienced player, you are interested in combat, and you favor guns. Okay, cool. I know what merits you have. I know where your attribute focuses are. I know which kith I can tell which kith you've chosen by looking at your character anyway. But I know probably 40% of what's on your sheet just by having that information, because there's only one competitive way to build whatever character it is that you're wanting to play. Yeah. And personally, I consider that to be a problem.
It also, like, the thing that I was having the most trouble with thinking about if I were going into this as a new player is, like, a combination of one-dimensional options doesn't make things multi-dimensional. Like,
agreed.
The archetypes are very flat. The courts are very flat.
Yes.
The kiths are not flat, but the way your kith is interpreted through the lens of your court is.
Yes.
So, there's enough information to figure out how the concept you have in mind can become this living, breathing character. But the categories that you have to work with, they're always kind of going to be accessories to that. And the book just doesn't bring it together enough.
Exactly.
I don't know if that's less important in a LARP because of that PvP thing, but I don't know. I feel like I would want to be spending a lot more time proportionally developing that character side in my interactions rather than, okay, everyone, put 4 hours aside. We're about to try a mass combat. So
I've heard it said that writers write the stories that they want to read and game designers design the games they want to play. I've never seen a better example of that than this particular book.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, the folks who wrote BNS Dreaming have a very specific play style that is devoted to this large, organized play, long-running campaign style. And they enjoy playing particular types of characters, because I know some of these people. I mean, I'm familiar with their playstyle. And they've designed character creation to facilitate the kind of characters that they want to play. And if you happen to want to play a different type of character, that is not supported.
Well, that's unfortunate.
Indeed.
Briefly, let's just talk about this table on page 121 with seeming as a background. So per this chart, if I understand correctly, as you advance your character, you get more banality and your pool of glamour shrinks. You get potential bonus attributes above the usual cap of 5, but skills cost more. You lose downtime actions. So it's a very mechanized system for your character to steadily get worse, but be more respected as you advance.
Basically, this is one of the big things about the By Night Studio system is they've focused on cross-venue compatibility. And I think that this chart is at least partially an answer to what they started with Vampire the Masquerade, because in Vampire, it's mechanically superior to play an Elder as opposed to playing a Neonate. And so they had to come up with a mechanical reason why you would want to play a Neonate instead of an Elder. And then they had to carry that same system through Werewolf and now Changeling. So the XP break on the skills is pretty significant, as is the downtime action bonus. Those are significant inducements to play a younger, less powerful character.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to play an elder character with it, or a legend, as the term is. Like,
At this point, I wouldn't either. There's really not a good reason to do so, except for the paragraph, because we're on that page now.
well, all right. So yes, is this the maximum arts paragraph?
Yes.
Is there another reference to this anywhere else in the book? Because I went looking.
No,
That's
there
what I
is
thought.
not. And that's why this tends to get overlooked and ignored.
Yeah.
And I'm not even going to speculate on whether it's ignored because people genuinely don't notice it or because they look at it and say, no, I'm going to absolutely choose not to have seen that.
Well, it also, like, it goes from, it says, a foundling can learn 2 arts at 5 dots, while a legend can learn all arts at 5 dots. All arts means 19. So how do you get from 2 to 19 over 5 steps mathematically is what I want to know.
Yeah, it would be nice to have that information.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I did see it. I just didn't understand it. So
yeah. Again, one of the nice things that they did here, because it was discussed in the Shining Host episodes about XP bloat.
Yes.
And BNS has fixed XP bloat. I'll give them that. Credit where credit's due.
Mm-hmm.
They completely revamped the XP system to be very similar to tabletop. They fixed it so that by the end of 6 months, you don't actually have all of your skills maxed out and everything else. So there is a much longer learning curve by the XP limitation. So it's probable that you're not actually going to have enough XP to max out all the arts. But again, where's the curve?
Well, who needs it?
Yeah.
Anything else from character creation that we should flag before we get to the merits and flaws?
You mentioned that each of the skills has some little extra bonus mechanic.
Yes.
Those two are incredibly unbalanced. There are some skills that are absolutely vital to take depending on your character type. Like if you're a combat character, yes, obviously you would take the combat-oriented skills, but it's not just sensible to do so, it's required to maintain a competitive edge. But the biggest thing is that there's several skills in there which give you additional downtime actions. I don't know if downtime actions are a big deal in small troop LARPs, but in large, long-running organized play LARPs, downtime actions are huge. They're really as important, if not more so, to getting things done between games than what you do during the actual game session. And it's just incredibly unbalanced. You have a default of 3 downtime actions, but by taking the right skills and the right merits, I think you can get up to 7 downtime actions per month.
See, that's the kind of thing which, as someone unfamiliar with this, I would go completely over my head as well.
Exactly. And part of me kind of feels good about it in the sense of you get out what you put into it, that if you study the system and really, dig in and go through all the details and have experience, that your experience and attention is rewarded. But on the other, it also seems like it's punishing new players or casual players, and that's not cool.
Yeah. Well, I guess you just have to be diligent and make sure that you cross-reference pages 112 through 115 with whatever the section is on downtime actions in this, again, 400-page behemoth.
Exactly. Or just find an experienced player code
or
and say, help!
Yes. So let's talk about the arts and realms.
Yes. Oh, boy.
A couple things here. So key difference to bear in mind is that there is still a division between commoner and noble arts.
Mm-hmm.
Some arts aren't assigned to either category, and those must always be taught, but the commoner and noble ones you can just kind of have. Glamour cost is included in the description rather than there being this weird versus chimerical division. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of attention to duration, eye contact, targeting, and physicality, all of which makes total sense. And sometimes I do kind of wish there was more of that in tabletop.
Agreed. That early section on just arts in general, I really like. They did that really well.
Yeah.
Especially taking into account the tabletop versus LARP dynamic. I mean, it's one thing to get eye contact with the player across the table from you. It's quite another to get eye contact with the guy at the other end of the large dining hall.
And this is a chapter where I feel you can really see where they applied feedback, because a lot of the cantrips are like, in this special edge case, here's what you do. And it seems like these all came out of people saying, well, this happened and we didn't know how to handle it.
That's part of it, yes. But it's also, again, coming from the Mind's Eye Society. Because what Pete was saying in the Shining Host episodes about how he wrote arts fairly loosely and open to interpretation because as the storyteller, he could just say, no, that's an abuse of the rules and I'm not going to let you do that. In a large LARP game with an organized play, the storyteller is not actually the final arbiter. I, as the storyteller, cannot say just because the rules don't say that you can't do it, that doesn't mean that you're allowed to. If the rules are not absolutely explicit in forbidding a thing, I pretty much have to allow it to happen as the storyteller. Because of that, there's a lot of abuse. Players go out of their way to find loopholes and exploit loopholes. It's almost a toxic little sub-game of how can I find a way to break this and still point at the rules and say I'm allowed to do it.
It's just like Mage.
Pretty much, yeah. And because the developers are Mind's Eye Society LARPers, they wrote the rules with that mindset in full bloom.
That also kind of, it makes sense in light of the fact that there's no unleashings as well.
True.
I can just imagine what people would do with that.
Oh, no, you can't. No, you cannot have unleashings in an organized play LARP. No.
Forbid.
And did I mention no? Somehow in my memory in the years that had been since I had read over the BNS book, I had thought that they had adhered more towards C20 arts. And no.
Same number of them is there.
Yeah. Oh boy. So shall we just do a quick
let's just go through.
Sure.
So we have arboreal, which is kind of like spring.
A little spring with a little of the C20 primal thrown in. Yeah.
Chicanery, it's weird. It's like just the illusion / memory emotion altering side plus mooch got moved in here for some reason.
Yep.
Chronos, close enough, I think.
Yeah, close enough.
Oh yeah, you put close enough on.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have dread, which is like fear magic, so kind of like autumn.
Kind of. I mean, there's a good bit of autumn, but there's one power in it that's a little bit of twisted oniomancy. It's the only real dream or sleep-oriented thing that we get in the entire game.
Yeah, because there's no oneiromancy at all. Not really any dreaming. We'll get to that later.
Yeah.
So there's fabricate, which is basically infusion plus crafting rules.
It is, and we'll get to the crafting and equipment rules later, because an entire art that deals with a really unsatisfying subgame.
There's a lot of unsatisfying subgames in here, I've noticed.
Yeah.
Then the best one, which is Inglenook.
I love Inglenook. I would transplant Inglenook into C20 if I could.
It's like healing plus commoner's sovereign, I guess you could call it.
Exactly.
Hearth magic.
I adore Inglenook. It's probably the single best thing in the BNS game.
Yeah. Then Kairos, where I assume they meant Cryos, which is the word for ice magic.
Yeah. One would think. Which, that was an interesting thing, because when we get to the merits and flaws section, there's a Shadow Court specific merit that makes Cryos a Shadow Court affinity art for you that you can get it at you can buy it as a discounted rate. And that merit implies that the art is restricted to the Shadow Court.
Yeah.
But there's no actual indication of that in the art write-up.
Go figure.
Go figure.
This is what happens when you get multiple writers and not enough editors.
True.
We have metamorphosis, which is basically metamorphosis. Naming is basically naming.
Yeah, not much they could really do about that. Yeah.
Then primal is split into primal and oaken shield, which are like the protective and, I guess, forceful side, respectively.
Honestly, it's vampire fortitude and vampire pose.
Yes.
Changeling skin slapped onto it.
And wafer kind of becomes celerity too, right? Like, yeah.
Yep.
Pyretics is pyretics.
Yeah.
Then revelry, which is not revelry as in C20, but instead it's kind of summer. Party magic.
Yes, party magic, exactly.
There's skullduggery, which is like stealthy chicanery.
Yeah, it's a little chicanery, a little legerdemain, and a little twisty.
Yeah, they kind of reshuffled those two arts in particular. Skycraft, I felt like, was more in line with old Skycraft, but pretty much the same.
Yeah, again, close enough.
Yeah. Soothsay, close enough.
Yeah, it's had a little bit of vampire aspects in it, but okay, fine, sure.
Yeah. Sovereign.
Ooh.
It's sovereign, but things are kind of weird.
Mm-hmm.
Like, grandeur is 5, and in light of this being changeling skin on vampire bones, it's like, oh, well, because presence 5.
Yeah, this is a little bit of presence, but a lot of dominate.
Yeah.
And again, I understand swapping the power levels for LARP in that, because again, you've got a lot more people usually in one room. So some powers that are less important at a tabletop become more powerful in a LARP and therefore probably should come later in the power development. I'm fine with that. But still, it just seems like they took a lot of vampire and just reskinned it.
Yes. Wah, wah.
Yeah.
We have Tailcraft, which is the most meta of LARP arts.
Oh, Lord. And that, it's so open to abuse.
I can imagine.
Again, the playtesting that I was part of, we had one player who was actually from an improvisational theater background, and he took Tailcraft.
Oh,
I mean,
Lord.
he was a good player. He was skilled. He was responsible. So it was not a problem, but he pretty much owned the session. Just, he was the star. He was the main character. He was good at it. I'm not criticizing his performance, but he completely took over and everybody else was superfluous.
And that's the kind of thing which, why would you allow that to happen? Because no one's going to want to play it after that.
Except that, again, in a large, long-running organized play LARP, you're not allowed to say no.
So with all of these, I mean, fine. Oh, and realms, just for the record, realms don't have levels. You just have a realm. Mm-hmm. They have taken the conditional stuff out of time and made a new realm called condition. So,
yes, which honestly, I really do like that, though I think that the XP cost on it is a little too expensive. Yeah. It's arguably the single most expensive XP thing in the game.
I also noticed that time is said to have 4 possible effects, but they only give you 2, which I feel cheated.
Well, yeah. I just wasn't going to mention that because the other 2 clearly are just late.
So yeah, that's Arts and Realms.
Yes.
We get to, I also have to say, I wish this book just had some freaking bookmarks in the PDF.
Oh, goodness, really yes. Nice. Yeah, I ended up taking a screenshot of the table of contents just so that I could move around more easily.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, we have another quote from a Slua at the start. Is Slua particularly popular as a character choice?
With a very, very small subset of players.
Okay.
Basically, if you play only rogue in your D&D group, then you play Slua.
There you go.
Uh-huh.
So I don't think we need to go into like the details of all of the merits and flaws, but just mechanically to point out some of like how the things work in the LARP system. So there are some merits or flaws, for example, that there's one that like gives you a -5 penalty to opponents on certain rolls, or that give you 3 points of glamour, which sounds like a lot, but it feels like the tests that these things influence regularly involve double-digit numbers. It seems like glamour is quickly accrued and spent, and many of the bonuses from the sort of magical powers and the merits have impacts that are measured over the course of minutes or hours of LARP time. So it does feel tailored to those dynamics in a way that for a tabletop player, you might look and be like, wait, what? But it's actually not that overpowered. I'm sure there are still some in here that are overpowered.
There are. There's one in particular, I think it's called Versatile, that gives you a second attribute focus.
Okay.
And if you're building your character to be good at more than one thing, or if you're building your character to be an absolute master of one particular art, it's required that you take that merit.
Okay.
You simply cannot be competitive without that merit. And it's a 3-point merit, which means that therefore it's not possible that you'll be able to fully express your kith or have a deep connection with your court.
Yeah. Because, the kith merits, so each of them has a 1, 2, and 3-point merit. And are any of the birthrights like contained fully within 1, or like you have to take at least 2 to kind of get the...
I would say that you have to have at least 2 of them to feel like your kith. And you need all 3 of them to fully embody your kith.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, and if you don't take any of them apart from any makeup or costuming that you choose to do in your realm affinities, are you really even that kith?
are you even a changeling? Did you take that dot in seeming? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But I do like that they have court merits. I think that's
Yes.
something I wish we saw more of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I like the fact that there are kith-specific merits and court-specific merits. I just don't like the fact that they're so completely required to be your character and that there's the hard cap of 7 points.
Yeah.
The nifty thing that I really do genuinely like, and that I probably should have brought up when we were talking about the arts, is that each level of the power will have an attribute focus where you get an extra little bonus power if you have the correct attribute focus.
So I want to use that as a segue to move into talking about the systems that occupy Chapter 7. So can you just give, this is like the elevator pitch, can you, in 30 seconds or less, give a very basic rundown of how the tests and challenges work in LARP? Like, we're not rolling dice. What are we doing?
We're playing rock, paper, scissors.
We sure are, but with fashion.
Yes, we are. And the hand gestures.
Yes. Oh, I love the hand gestures later, the photos.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the fact that they gave us photos, cool. Awesome. Good choice.
Yeah.
They have a really nice, well laid out explanation of how testing works. It's very thoughtfully explained, and maybe even a little too in-depth, but this is an instance where more is definitely better than less.
Mm-hmm.
But it does ultimately boil down to, I declare that I'm going to use a power on you. You take any sort of evasive action or blocking or countering or whatever. We throw rock, paper, scissors. There may or may not be a retest if we don't like how that outcome happened. And then a few other minor details might be involved, and then the result happens. Boom.
Okay.
If we happen to tie on the rock, paper, scissors, then we'll compare traits, which is where our attributes and a few other things can come in. And
like those merits and flaws.
Like the merits and flaws, like equipment, things like that. And then the higher number of traits will win on the tie.
And there's a thing too about like if your pool of those things greatly exceeds someone else's, you can, is it retest for free?
Yes.
Okay.
I believe that's the case, yes.
So is all of that more or less how it was in the Shining Host as well?
Apart from the retest for free, there was a thing called overbid, but I suppose you could say it was for free because there wasn't really a bid involved. So yeah, it's about the same.
Okay. So there's one big thing that I want to talk. There's a lot in here about combat and damage and health and stuff, mm-hmm. which I am comfortable glossing over unless there's anything specific you want to call out. But
not especially.
Because the fundamental question that I have as someone who's interested in playing this is about the play experience. Mm-hmm. And my sense is that this book in particular is not particularly concerned with that, maybe to your point about the kinds of characters and the kinds of games they wanted to run. It's kind of like, here's every mechanical thing and outcome and whatever you could possibly want. To me, getting into the headspace of playing this character, I need more than just that. Mm-hmm. And the big elephant in the room to me that I particularly was grappling with here is the fact that you don't, as a character, reincarnate. The fact that there is no separation between physical and chimerical death is massive. So, I don't know.
It's a huge problem. And honestly, again, I think it comes down to wanting to be compatible with the BNS vampire and werewolf offerings. Yeah. That when those characters die, they're out. And they wanted to carry that forward. But I think it was a very poor choice.
Yeah, because like there's a thing, where is it? When you're talking about banality and like banality triggers, you can gain permanent banality by participating in the death of a fae. Mm-hmm. And it's like, if the trade-off is you are permanently taking a foe out of the equation, wouldn't that be a totally fine? Like, it really speaks to that PvP mentality. And
it does.
It's really...
Yeah, let's face it, Mind's Eye Society is primarily a PvP game.
Okay.
And because these folks designed this book for the game that they wanted to play, and that was the game they wanted to play, this is a PvP book.
I would imagine it's really hard to sustain that as a long-running, like to be a long-running character. If the game is pointed towards pitting you against other players, how can you hope to have any kind of arc, I guess? Short of just, I'm leveling up my seeming and getting the consequences of that.
Well, I'm going to have to push back on that one because, again, this is LARP.
Yeah.
The entire purpose is to clump up with other people.
Okay.
So just because that red cap has really annoyed me and I'm inclined to end his story arc, he's also probably inclined to end mine, but I've got 5 friends and he's only got 3.
So it's a strength in numbers kind of.
It's a strength in numbers thing, and it's almost like a heist story in that the majority of the story is not the actual taking of the thing, it's the setup.
Okay.
And so it's all of the maneuvering and the politicking and the setting up for what could happen and the dealing with the possible ramifications and the covering of your tracks and all of that you're doing with you and your group of 5 friends, knowing that red cap and his group of 3 friends are also doing those same maneuvers against you. So honestly, the going out and stomping that red cap is almost anticlimactic. It's the more fun is in the machinations to set it all up.
I wish the book were able to tell me that more clearly.
Agreed.
See, that would have been something I would want front and center, and we're coming up on page 212, and it's like
right. And nothing in this book actually implies, hey, it really helps if you actually make friends.
Right.
Not to mention there's always the issue of, well, okay, we've made friends. I've got my 5 friends, but one of my 5 friends is a she, and I really don't like she. So maybe as much as I don't like that red cap, I've got something on the side with that red cap that, well, we're going to have our rumble, but when he goes to attack that she, I'm just going to accidentally not be in a position to defend my she ally. Oops.
Treachery.
So sad.
So we get another story about a changeling economics class, which I actually thought was pretty cute.
I do. Yes, I enjoyed that one as well.
Did feel like there was a syndicate plant in the room, but so for these systems chapters, I think we can largely focus on things that are similar or different between this book and other Mind's Eye Theater or BNS stuff, as well as between this book and C20. A lot of the stuff in this chapter, at least, is a rehash of core book material. Mm-hmm. So we're moving into chapter 8, Dramatic Systems.
Yes.
We start with addressing the classic changeling myths, which may or not be true. We go through physiology and talk about cold iron. I thought the clock aspect for carrying cold iron was kind of interesting.
It was. And again, that was a LARP requirement. That the moment that you tell a player, not a character, but a player, that here's the most effective way to kill your enemy.
Yes.
Regardless of how much it's going to be a problem for you as well, they will immediately figure out a way, well, how can I minimize the issues that I have with it?
Down comforters.
Yep.
Wrap it up.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, it's material that I'm going to bear in mind with a tabletop game.
Yeah.
There's bits about the mists and chrysalis, which are more or less in line with the base game. Mm-hmm. And this, I think, is where we get the note, on page 215, that changelings do not awaken under the age of 16, for LARP purposes at least.
For LARP, yeah. Which, again, for LARP, I don't like it, but I accept it. I once LARPed with a 35-year-old man who was pretending to be a 10-year-old Slua boy, and let's just say that it was not a comfortable experience. Yes, moving on.
And then suddenly we get a Kinane Quick Start character creation guide, which comes out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
How does this compare to the way Kinane were handled in Shining Host in particular?
This is probably the only thing that I'd say BNS is superior to Shining Host on. Just that, I mean, Kinane was handled well enough in Shining Host. It was handled, I think, better in Shining Host than it was in most of the tabletop material, even though, yes, I adored the Enchanted book. But still, it streamlined it enough to make it easy for a new player to hop in, especially when you take into account my boyfriend wants to visit the LARP tonight.
Yes.
While at the same time giving Kinane enough oomph to make them a viable part of the game. So full marks.
Yeah. Because it seems like their mechanical trade-off is that their banality fades, unlike a changeling's, mm-hmm. and they get extra downtime actions.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a nice balancing rather than the dramatic overpowering they get in C20 Core Book.
Right.
They also just kind of wind through setting lore and mechanical information back and forth in a way that feels very different from the other chapters. I'm just kind of noticing that.
Yeah, this does seem very much a kitchen sink chapter, and at the same time almost a stream of consciousness chapter.
Yeah, exactly. Well, on page 217, they finally spell Fei Mian correctly.
Yes.
It only took them 8 chapters to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We get the mechanics of Glamour, including the creating chimerical items out of nowhere that Josh has talked about before.
Yep.
There's notes about epiphanies and handling those through downtime actions or quests, which we will get to momentarily, but it doesn't seem like there's rapture or revelry.
No, the revelry is completely gone, and rapture...
Is that a quest also?
I believe it's a quest, yes.
Okay, all right.
Or it could easily be handled as such, yes.
But before we get to quests, I want to talk about banality for a second, because we have a new term here where temporary banality is now called ennui. I'm not going to get into that. What I did notice was that you only need 5 points of temporary to bump up your permanent score by 1. And even though they list triggers, it seems like they're going back to the direct, if a thing happens, you get a point system,
right,
with some really severe ones mixed in. So it's not really a trigger. It's just kind of doing this thing gets you, in some cases, it will get you a dot of banality. If you participate in the death of another changeling, you get 5 points of ennui. That becomes a permanent dot. So I want to ask, during playtesting, how rapidly were people gaining banality?
Oddly enough, not very rapidly at all.
Interesting.
Yeah. When I was playtesting, I was a storyteller more than I was a player, but I did get the chance to play sometimes. So I can't address how other storytellers handled things, but when I was storytelling, it was like, again, these competitive, mechanics-minded, optimizing players had studied the banality rules and knew exactly how to...
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it does seem like the way it's presented here without any kind of context or guidance, it does seem to reinforce the kind of live fast, die quick feeling of the setting. And I do mean die quick.
Yes.
And similarly, Bedlam seems to ratchet up very quickly. It's contagious. It has a lot of like risks to gaining it that are very common. It's recommended that storytellers only assign a single point during a scenario, which is good because the list they give you, it seems like it would be very easy to get several of them within an hour. So
again, I can't speak to how other groups, how their experience went, but the players studied what caused Bedlam and banality, and they were so careful about towing right up to that line and not putting that toe over and then just sort of giving me a smug look and saying technically correct is the best kind of correct.
Did they actually say that? Because that would be like...
One player actually did.
That's when you introduce a dragon and let them figure it out.
If not for the fact that this was organized play and I don't have that ability, Yeah.
Anyway.
But yeah, it looks like it should be a massive, punitive, brutal system, and it should be, but it's easily avoided.
Noted for if I ever end up in any of these games.
Yeah.
So then kind of randomly, we get downtime actions and dramatic time, followed by some very spare mechanics for Dreaming Realms and some rather more elaborate mechanics for quests. And I know you've got a thing or two you'd like to say about quests.
I really, really want to like quests. I do like quests from a storyteller perspective. This is a thing that players should never have seen and should never have been available for them to understand. Quests are a thing that the storyteller should read over, familiarize, internalize, and then throw away and do it better.
Seems reasonable, especially if it's your first time going through this. Yeah.
But by the same token, that it does actually have a lot of value in that it's so hard for a storyteller, especially a new storyteller, or if you're a storyteller, again, of a large, long-running game, when you never know which players are going to show up for a given session.
Yeah.
It can be really difficult to tailor-make a quest in the narrative sense for the players that you're going to have when you don't know what players you're going to have.
Yeah.
So having these mechanics can really be a lifesaver in terms of, well, how can I put this together? How can I make this fair? How can I give the players the chance to really put things together and maximize their chances for success, and then doing the narrative? But again, it's so mechanical. It's so banal.
Yes.
It's so banal.
It kind of overcorrects for what we get in C20, because while I am glad to see quests that have something to do other than removing banality from stuff in here, like there's actual different constructive things you can do with it.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's very, like, giving your quests a set number of requirements and a difficulty rating and a categorization and basing this and that on it. It's like, yeah.
But by the same token, too, they gave us a difficulty rating chart finally.
Yes.
We've never had one in a LARP before that I'm aware of. No, certainly not one that's readily referenced.
And worksheets to keep track of this all, because
Yes.
you certainly need it.
Yes. I mean, on the one hand, bravo for giving us the worksheets, but shame on them for needing a worksheet.
Yeah. Again, the overcorrection.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Quests were introduced in the Werewolf by Night Studios book. And so, again, they got to bring it over and reskin it.
Yeah. But then we get some gestures. So.
Yes.
I'm going to use the I'm exceptionally imposing gesture just in my daily life from now on. People better get it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, to your point, like it goes from like players' information about essential game mechanics to storyteller's companion and back and forth within the space of this chapter.
These final chapters, they have a lot of good information in them, but there could have been some better layout done. Some of these sections could have been rearranged or something. There's something lacking, and I can't fully put my finger on how it could have been improved.
Well, speaking of those later chapters, moving on to chapter 9. With some heavy exposition by redcaps in between, which honestly gives us more about the setting changes than a lot of the other text as they eat the she they've been paid to kill.
It does, yes. Grimjaw the Redcap's explanation of Shadow Court and revolutionary ideals, honestly, it really kind of touched something in me as a Changeling player.
Yeah.
And for that matter, even with things happening in the real world, and no need to go into modern real life politics, but
the title of the story is Eat the Rich, which tells you all you need to know.
Exactly. But I could see where Grimjaw was coming from, not gonna lie.
So going back to my earlier question about like how did the Shadow Court just kind of step in so easily and so quickly, I could certainly see that happening in 2020 more than in 2000, and backed up by this kind of narrative not 2/3 deep into the book.
Exactly. I would have liked this Grimjaw story to have been much, much earlier in the book. Yes.
The introduction even.
Yeah, this would have been a better introduction than the sacrifice of the she-lady, I think.
Yeah, who cares about her? I'm sure whoever her player was cares.
Yeah, that story was nice and should be kept, but they could have swapped places.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, social systems. So we get prestige, which is werewolf renown in clothing from Changelings.
Exactly. Yes, werewolf and vampire stuff reskinned again, which again, I liked the concept, but this has become its own little mini game.
Yeah.
And it's not a very good mini game.
Yeah. I mean, I like it, but it does it's not really necessary for anything else.
It's like they tried. Okay, personally, I think that Changeling is the second most political game out of all of the White Wolf games.
Agreed.
It's second only to Vampire. And so having a robust political system is a good thing. But having Vampire's robust political system, not so much.
Wasn't there a prestige system of some kind in... Or no, I'm thinking of the influence system, maybe.
I believe that you're thinking about influence.
In Shining House.
Yes.
Okay. Because I really liked that when we read that book. I was like, oh wow, this is really great.
Yeah, influence was amazing, and they butchered it in BNS.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Well, we're getting there.
We'll get there.
I also have to say, page 252, 253, these printout cards. Why would you put a printout card across the spine of a 2-page?
Yeah. Again, it needed another pass in terms of all manner of editing.
Yeah. Anyway, we get oaths. Bunks are apparently not cantrip difficulty reducers, but rather they are recast here as further mini-games reflecting the rituals and ceremonies of Changeling society. I hate when game terms get reused for something different like this.
Especially when it's something completely different. Bunks are now Sabbat games of instinct.
Is that what they are in the Vampire?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah, the Sabbat in Vampire have games that they play, things like Capture the Pack Priest and Stealing Mortals for Fun and Profit and various different things that it's almost like TikTok challenges.
I mean, literally, that's probably what people are doing with it these days.
Yeah, and that's what they've made bunks into, and it makes me sad. But I really do like the way they handled oaths.
Yeah, I mean, they're fine. I mean, they have the framework elaborated similarly to quests, but more simply.
More simply, and they give you a flat maximum number of oaths that you can undertake.
Yeah.
It's well laid out. It could be better, but I'm not going to complain.
Yeah. After that, we get all the politics stuff. Here's where the meta plot is spelled out a little more explicitly.
Mm-hmm.
The escheat is given with the note that the Shadow Court, despite their historical carping about it, actually find it a useful tool. There are details for the different noble titles from High Regent on down.
Mm-hmm.
Each one has a range of title-specific prestige benefits. And the court titles and the freehold titles that we get later, I do like that side of it as well. But again, I could see that becoming a mini game too.
It is a mini game, but honestly, this one I think is a pretty necessary mini game.
Yeah.
Again, with the structure of a LARP, people want to have a position. People want to be important. And there's enough stuff here that anybody who wants to be important can have something to campaign for and scheme for and manipulate for to become important.
It's like running for treasurer for the student body.
Exactly. If you don't want to mess with it, you're not obligated to do so. But if you've got the ambition, there's something there that will fit.
Yeah. So then we have an offensively short rest of the world section.
Yeah.
Which, again, talk about needing an editor. Nustria becomes Nuestra at one point. Greece is assigned to 2 different kingdoms. It's just a mess.
Yeah, I would have almost rather they skipped that section entirely. Just nope.
Yep.
Nope. This is exclusively United States based, and
also Canada.
Well, yeah, there was an interesting little bit of tension in Mind's Eye Society at the time that this was all happening, where the Canadian chapters and regions of Mind's Eye Society were justifiably unhappy about American dominance of the shared narrative and how American games were forcing some of their specific rules onto the Canadian games. And well, frankly, the Canadian rules were better and more sensitive to inclusivity and that sort of thing. And the Canadian folks made a good faith effort to come to the table. The American folks said, nah, we're in charge. And so ultimately the Canadian folks said, no, you're not. We're going to take our better rules and go make our own club.
Can they publish a book on the Storytellers Vault? Because I feel like...
I would love it if they did, because their stuff was better.
Yeah. You heard it here, audience.
Yeah. Oh, well.
I will dream that universe into existence.
Yes, they detailed Canada beautifully, and it was just better. Oh, anyway. Okay. Yeah.
So yes, then we get houses, which they're kind of flattened into their boon just being an additional skill trait, and their bane being a -1 penalty on stuff. There's not really much to define them here.
There's not, but they made Islandhead unseelie.
Yeah, well, if they were going to make any of the core 5 into it, that's the one I would assume they would.
I agree, but there was no need to make any of them unseelie.
No, it's true, yeah. Again, it's that one-dimensionality that's just kind of they're all in on. And
yeah, I mean, if they had to pick one, they picked the right one. But it was an unforced error.
Also, no House Danan, probably because there's no dreaming, but we'll get to that.
Yeah.
There are societies that get slight prestige bumps, but I am disappointed. One of the things I really liked in the older books was like the fun little costuming hints that we got for these. I'm like, oh, it's unfortunate.
It is. Yeah, there's really a total absence of any kind of costuming or makeup tips in this entire book.
Or set dressing.
Right, yeah. I did a lot of set dressing for my playtesting, and it was entirely stuff that I had to come up with. There was no assistance. There was no tips, no tricks, no suggestions. It was me going out and buying a fog machine and yards of netting. And anyway.
So something I want to ask also as we get into the freehold section here, how much of the LARP games revolve around creating, managing, stealing, protecting, destroying freeholds and balefires? Because it seems like a lot, but...
There's a lot in the book and next to none in actual play. Unless a newly formed game is going out of its way to start from scratch, they're going to almost always start with an existing freehold that just, poof, it was always there.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah. And because pretty much every individual game... Okay, so with a large game like Mind's Eye Society, and as a result, this book, there would be local games set in individual cities. So if a new game forms up in a city that hadn't previously had a game, just suddenly, as far as the entire rest of the world is concerned, oh yeah, that game, that freehold was always there. We just never messed with it before.
How convenient.
Yes, how convenient. At the same time, okay, I'll give it a pass.
Yeah.
You don't always want to play the hard Scrabble startup. Sometimes you just want to get started. And okay,
yeah,
that's
okay. Fair.
Yeah. And while there is a good bit of visiting from one game to another with players traveling, or sometimes players just sending their sheets but not actually showing up themselves, which is its own awkward thing, because pretty much every group has a freehold, and therefore every group has access to similar levels of resources in terms of glamour and power and that sort of thing, there's really very little ambition to go after somebody else's resources when you already have everything that you need. And add to that too, if you're in Chicago and the game that you're wanting to attack their freehold is in Pittsburgh, do you really want to drive from Chicago to Pittsburgh every month or every other week to maintain your control over that game?
I mean, I've done it once and that was enough. So
Exactly. You've done it once. That was enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will also just gently point out that all of this directly undercuts the whole setting conceit of resources are scarce and the Shadow Court stepped in because they had resources. So
exactly. Yeah. It greatly undercuts that. And again, I understand it that sometimes the needs of the actual play experience trump the needs of the setting. But again, it was another unforced error.
Yeah. And I don't love, honestly, I mean, I'm always up for mini games and social stuff because that's what I thrive on much more than like combat mechanics. But
definitely,
it feels like they really don't want you to make any kind of story-driven choice without mechanics. You know?
Yes, there is nothing in here that does not ultimately boil down to a mechanical chop.
Which I can understand in a LARP session where you can't attend to like 30 different people's desire for personal growth at once, but just keeping track of all of it must be hell. Do storytellers just kind of become calculators because you're constantly measuring benefits and drawbacks and expenditures in relation to each other, tracking it from situation to situation? And it just seems like it would be difficult to have people just role play.
Well, that's actually kind of a pleasantly surprising thing that with a large group like that, the storyteller will put a plot line into play, and then they'll step back.
Okay.
And they'll let the players twist things, and they'll go off on red herrings, and they'll hone in on tiny little details that you never even considered and completely ignore the main clue that you've hung from a string in front of their face. And they'll do their mechanics among themselves. And honestly, the only time that the storyteller really is called in to pay attention is if there's an argument.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I've gone entire games in a session as a storyteller where I've delivered the opening announcements, sat back and just watched and listened, and sometimes taken notes because the clues that the players have made up for themselves are actually cooler than what I had in mind. And so, yeah, that's the plot now. Then I'll step in when I notice that, oh, those three people have been sitting on the sidelines. So, okay, I'm going to throw something at them to bring them into the main group. But other than that, one of the main appeals of a large LARP like this, and again, I reiterate, this book is designed for large LARPs, is it's self-sufficient. The storyteller doesn't have to keep track of all of these fiddly bonuses and penalties and whatnots because each of the individual players will do so. And there's a large degree of honor system, but there's also a large degree of players really watching each other.
I mean, you have to, right? Because
you have to, and
so many opportunities to mess with things.
And as much as I hate to say it, yes, there's the honor system, but there's also a pretty significant snitch culture. Player A will be thrilled to go to the storyteller, pull him aside to one, off to the side there and say, hey, player B, they don't actually have a power on their sheet that they're using. You should go deal with that. On the one hand, okay, great. Now you investigate and you take care of the problem. On the other, it damages the honor system, and it's helpful, but It's also just a little sleazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The next fiction infuriated me, I have to just say. Because it was like, here's this grand whole thing that's been built up about like the Shadow Court's taken over and King Milga has taken over, and then someone just comes and is like, hey, I need you to kill the king. And the guy's like, okay, and then he goes and does it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I'm glad they're advancing the meta plot. It seems like a meta plot that will have no involvement from actual players and doesn't really seem to fit with the setting updates at all that they've laid out. So,
yep. Now, you could make the argument that the character is going to kill the king. There's no actual surety that he succeeded. And indeed, when you look at the book as a whole, it's pretty sure that he did not, because Milgi is still an active part of the meta plot. So,
I suppose, yeah.
Mm-hmm. I admire the craft of the story, but
yeah, I very much prefer the economics class.
Definitely.
That being said, Chapter 10 storytelling is, I think, hands down the best one in the book. And
yes.
I just kind of want to wax poetic for a few minutes, if you'll let me.
Please, do it.
So, I mean, there's the usual bit of grandiosity to open the chapter about, like, all characters are rooted in the strength of their stories. But actually, the step-by-step instructions for building a chronicle are pretty solid.
Marvelous.
They give you notes about theme and mood. And for LARP in particular, the attention to scaling and the number of players is essential, as well as the different contexts.
Yes.
So I don't doubt, like you're saying, that a lot of this grew from lessons learned by the people who have done this a lot.
Exactly.
However much I might question the setting or mechanics changes, this is expertly done.
This is all coming out of Mind's Eye Society and the 20-plus years that club has been in existence under various name changes. Yeah. This is the result of 20-plus years of use, abuse, and learning. And it's great.
I'm glad they were able to squeeze this out.
Yes.
Like, if you only read one chapter from this book, make it chapter 10.
Yeah. I mean, I would even read this chapter if you don't LARP. This is helpful for your tabletop.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It is your LARP.
Well, so like they give you formats for things like a style document and advice for creating a story Bible. And I've done a project management certificate. So I'm like, oh, it's a project charter, of course.
Yeah.
And those documents are helpful regardless of the format that you're running your game in.
Especially because they make a point of having those documents available to all the players at all times.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you're going to have it like on a wiki or something. Mm-hmm. It's helpful.
Yep.
There's notes about the economy of cool being the true economy of a game, which I think applies outside of LARP as well.
One of the developers actually wrote an essay called The Economy of Cool that was intended for Vampire LARP, but works just as well for pretty much any LARP. I'd really like for you to include a link to that in the show notes because...
So shall it be.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a fundamental change in how I looked at both playing and storytelling, period. And more people should be aware of it.
Like to your point about an improv trained person coming in and dominating an entire session, that's somebody who has unfairly cornered the economy of cool.
It's true. He did unfairly corner the economy of cool, but he also, because he was improv trained, he was able to reinvest. So he was able to say, by my use of the power, you get to do this cool thing. But it was still, the other person only got to do the cool thing because he used the power.
He was the Warren Buffett of LARPing.
Exactly. Yeah.
But maybe the most important piece here that I want to underscore is that changelings engage differently from humans when it comes to socially oriented plots.
Yes.
So, for example, changelings' seemings shift, and that influences their ideas on respect and prejudice. Mm-hmm. They have different values that influence their idea of conscience. Mm-hmm. And that's not only important for storytellers, but players to comprehend. So maybe that should have also been included somewhere outside this chapter.
Agreed.
You know, when we talk about these ideas of are changelings monsters and what does it mean to roleplay someone who's inhuman, it's like bearing those things in mind. I think Dark Ages Fae did a really good job of spelling that out. I remember when we read through that caught my attention. So I'm glad to see that here, for sure.
Yes, definitely.
And there's other story construction stuff. They bring up the monomyth, and then it's like, yeah, use it if you want.
Yeah.
Don't use it if you don't want.
Yeah. It's kind of inevitable at this point for Campbell to be referenced in Changeling.
Yes.
Yes.
And the newcomer incentives or new character incentives, for latecomers is nice to have, particularly because if your character dies, they won't reincarnate, so you're going to have to make a new one.
Exactly, and that's another thing that came directly from Mind's Eye Society. They have a Chronicle floor that if you join later in the Chronicle, you get a massive chunk of XP, and then you get more XP per month. They made some adjustments to it, but it's straight out of Mind's Eye Society.
So you can catch up quickly.
Yep. And honestly, you can make an argument that it's even a little bit of an unfair advantage to the new player, because the old players, they've had to buy powers and things incrementally and tend to be haphazardly, whereas the new player, if they've got a bunch, like a chunk of XP, they can spend it much more optimally.
They know what they're getting into from the start.
They know what they're getting into from the start, and they can also say, well, I'm going to go ahead and buy this entire power up to its maximum now, whereas a longer running player bought it over the course of a year.
They had to struggle through their Inglenook.
Yes.
Which is a sentence I didn't think I was ever going to say in my life.
I approve of that.
So we have some storytelling techniques, all of which I think we've seen before, like the fade to black and the time stop. There's advice on dealing with disruptive players and making sure the story stays on the rails, advice on downtime, the invaluable bit that no one makes good decisions at 2 a.m. Very good to know.
Yep.
At some point in here, there's the structure of like having narrators and assistants and everything. But all of that is in a tight, 30 pages, something like that. And I don't know how much it cleaves to the older Shining Host advice chapters, but I don't care. Like, all of this is excellent.
Yeah. I would say, based on the interviews that you did with Pete at the time, all of this stuff is what he had in his mind and his heart that didn't make it onto the page.
I put in my notes here, I would wager this was his contribution from the 2018 think tank.
Quite possibly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one glaring absence for me is a more extensive discussion about bleed, like the active part of metagaming or dealing with disruptive people, but the more subtle emotional side.
Agreed.
It kind of gets loosely sketched out, but I don't think it ever hurts to spell out very clearly, don't let your game impact your mental health or vice versa.
Right. This book was, for the most part, really good about handling issues of inclusion and sensitivity and that sort of thing. But this was the one glaring error. You're absolutely right. They missed the plot on this one. It
seems to be a regular feature of books that bring it up. Like, they bring it up. It is mentioned once in like that one paragraph in the introduction, and then you read 386 more pages and you're like, oh. But anyway, it transitions. The story is a she-duke asking his troll buddy Thog, with 1 or 2 G's, it's inconsistent, to rekindle a freehold at a cafe in a broken down small town, because obviously there's nothing he wants to do more. Chapter 11. There's so many freaking chapters.
So many. And doubly so, since at the table of contents they listed out the fiction pieces as their own part, so it even looks like there's more. We're almost. We're in the home stretch.
And again, I don't think we need to go into too much detail because this is just allies and antagonists. It's your standard, here's your NPCs, here's how to build them.
As a bestiary goes, I like it. They did well.
The one quibble I have is if we have the standard kiths, right, and there's no dual legacies, it's just there's the Seelie version of your kith, the Unseelie version of your kith, and the Shadow version of your kith. What is the point of having Thaleen? Because they are presented here as just the Shadow version of your kith.
Yes, that was definitely a failure. Yeah.
We have some self-serving crossover rules for the other Mind's Eye Theater books.
Yep.
And sample mages and wraiths who don't have their own Mind's Eye Theater book, so...
And almost certainly never will.
Yeah. Because there was so much detail for everything else in this book, crossover feels so much like an afterthought to me. I know it's a thing people are into, especially with LARP, but...
It is treated as an afterthought here, but that's almost okay because the BNS books have focused so heavily on compatibility.
Yeah.
That if you're playing Changeling and happen to own the BNS Vampire book, you can play crossover with absolutely no difficulties. The mechanics are nearly perfectly aligned. The only difference is that Vampire doesn't include questing, and that any vampire game that I've been a part of just says, use the questing rules from Werewolf or Changeling. Boom, done. Okay.
Super duper.
Yeah. So, yeah, the crossover stuff is self-serving, but I'm sure that BNS looks at that as a feature rather than a bug.
Yeah. What I would have wanted here, what would have been useful to me, is more about how to integrate the ones that are more meaningful for Changeling into a story. Mm-hmm. Similar to, I forget if it was Chapter 9 or Appendix 1 of the C20 Core, where they just shoved every kith ever printed in there.
Yes.
Without really updating or...
Yeah, the Chorid and the Vorpeltanger, whatever. Yeah,
yes, the Vorpatinger.
Yes, you and your linguistics.
I'm happy to have them in there for sure.
Oh,
but
definitely.
It's like,
but they weren't put in the right place.
No.
I can't really think of a better place for them, but that wasn't the right place.
I don't even think it would take much lifting. Like, give me a couple paragraphs about what should I do with these? What's your recommendation?
Yeah.
And on that subject, I think this is a good place as any to bring up, this is allies and antagonists. Most of them are antagonists.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to address the Nunyihi, I think it's perfectly reasonable to say, listen, we aren't culturally competent enough to do these justice.
Mm-hmm.
If you are, here's what we feel we can give you to help you build and integrate them. Have them as allies, have them as potential antagonists, have them as neither. Make them nuanced and three-dimensional, and acknowledge that they exist.
Exactly. Yeah. I fully support not going into detail on a thing that you're not qualified to go into detail on. I'm fine with that. And being aware of at least the presentation of the folks involved in this book. I'm not going to speculate on their backgrounds. I have no knowledge of that, but their presentation is not that of the indigenous population. And so, like I said, I'm on board with them not putting their noses in where they don't belong, but completely ignoring the situation wasn't the right choice either.
See also the Player's Guide Part 2 episode
right.
from a couple weeks ago.
Exactly.
Yeah. But other than that, I mean, it's your standard enemies chapter, I guess.
It is. And I mean, I think the reason that I'm as kind to the bestiary section as I am is just that that's one of the things that got a lot more love in BNS than got in Shining Host.
That's good.
We had some antagonists and allies stuff, but they weren't terribly well fleshed out, and they certainly didn't have this how to build a.
Yeah. Oh, the stock Chimera stuff I love.
Yes.
I mean, that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Again, it could have been better, but I was pleasantly surprised.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then chapter 12, and thankfully last.
Oh, yeah.
Influence and equipment. Influence is just, I don't know why it's here and not in the social systems, but...
Or in the background section.
Or in the background section, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So...
Because it's a background.
It is adapted from the Shining Host stuff, if I recall correctly.
It is. The Shining Host and all of the original Mind's Eye Theater line had influences. They had, I think, 10 different broad categories. Maybe it was 12. I don't recall exactly. But they boiled this down to just 2. It's elite and underworld.
Which is one hell of a dichotomy.
Definitely. And at the same time, doesn't cover the vast majority of what made Influence so interesting. Because Influence used to be its own complete minigame. You could ignore it entirely if you wanted to, or you could spend as much time playing the Influence game as you did playing the actual LARP. And this, it's just not supported.
Because it seems to be mostly about, like, the minigame is structured around attacking and defending downtime actions almost.
Mm-hmm. And it used to be so much more.
Yeah. That's unfortunate.
Back in the Shining Host days, people either loved Influence or hated Influence. And, okay, I can see that. Yeah. If you don't want to spend a massive amount of time with a spreadsheet monitoring your influences, that's totally valid. But it seems like BNS took the you love it or you hate it and decided to disappoint both sides.
It seems like there's a fair amount of that going on in this book.
Yeah.
There's a random note about props, weapons, and armor.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then we get stock locations and rules for creating them. Some guidance around how to structure games around gaining control of or losing control of and leveraging these locations, as well as some qualities they have.
And again, interesting system, never saw use.
I was going to say, I wonder how this shakes out when you're actually using it in public space, but...
It doesn't. Nope.
Great, we can just move on. We can keep speeding towards the end.
Yeah.
That's a shame, though, because I do kind of like this, and if I were running a game, I would want to use this.
And I think this might have been like a tiny little nod towards small troop LARP play, because I think this would be much more important in a small game that isn't linked with other cities and other games.
That makes a lot of sense in light of a certain discomfort I felt, because what I would not want is for a LARP to feel like I'm playing a game of Risk. in the sense of like trying to get territory and hold territory and do all of
Mm-hmm.
that, which I think you get from having 50 people doing this. But if it's just 4 people going from location to location, that works a lot better.
Exactly. And while it's much more prevalent in Vampire than it is in Changeling, in Mind's Eye Society, it is actually an ongoing thing that you get together 8 of your fellow players from your game and you go visit the game that's 30 miles away. And depending on your goals for the evening, you might be there to kick butt and chew bubblegum, or you might be there to help them deal with a Sabbat incursion. Either way, you are profoundly altering their game in ways that they may or may not have wanted.
Yeah. When you said kick butt and chew bubblegum, I was like, or vice versa. But
that too. Yes.
Yeah. That kind of spirit, I think, because that is on the surface how LARP has often been presented to me, particularly Vampire LARP.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, yeah, that's just a big old turnoff, that kind of style.
It is.
So.
Yes.
Then we get to the equipment.
Yes.
It can have qualities, of which there are umpteen that I'm not going to go through.
Exactly. One thing that really kind of caught my attention on this reread through, I don't know how familiar you are with the new story path system that Onyx Path has put out.
Yeah.
Right. And this really is very similar to the equipment situation there. And I don't know if it was a matter of like parallel evolution or if somebody had insight into the other development path. I don't know, but I noticed the overlap.
But even Dungeons and Dragons has started doing this to an extent.
True,
I think. I mean, I think it's just a change in role playing games as a rule. I mean, I've played Trinity and everything. I think there are still way more here than I've seen in any other game. So.
Oh, that's right. I remember you did have that actual play. That was a lot of fun. Yeah.
Oh,
that was well done. You did well.
Thank you. Anyway, this is where cold iron lives. This is where incendiary ammunition lives. This is where artisanal lives, and you can apply these things to your gear. The thing that I have to ask is how would you keep track of all of this in like a mass combat, you know?
Item cards.
Still.
You write it down on index cards or the little slips of paper that I think that there's an item card form later on in the book. Yeah.
It still seems really intense to like try and...
It is, but it also helps to have a physical representation of, okay, I've got this gun. Obviously, we're not allowed to have even prop weaponry in the LARP game because no, that's naughty. But it is helpful that I can dramatically pull my index card out of my shoulder holster and point it at you. Even though it's a piece of paper and not a gun, you still have an idea of, oh, there is a direct threat and it is pointed at that person.
Yeah. But also just because some of these, so I keep wanting to say tags because that's the term in StoryPath. Some of them are really complex.
Mm-hmm.
It's like...
And again, some of them are really unbalanced.
Yeah. Oh, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
If you're actually like building an item, does it say like this tag costs more than this one, or?
There are, if I recall correctly, there are some tags that have requirements before you can put them on there.
Okay.
Like having crafts or security or things like that. And that's also where you get fabricate the art being involved.
Well, speaking of fabrication, that's a good opportunity to bring up the final meaty section of this book, which is treasures.
Yes. And let's just go ahead and address the really, really cranky part.
Yes.
Back in character creation under backgrounds, treasure has always been a background, and it still is. But treasure doesn't actually give you a treasure. It just gives you the opportunity, the capacity.
The dream, if you will.
The dream of owning a treasure. I mean, granted, yes, they give you some vague ideas as to how to go about acquiring a treasure, but it's functionally impossible to begin the game with one outside of storyteller fiat. As much as I objected to C20's treatment of treasures being just sticking art into an item, this isn't much better.
No.
It's better, but not much.
Stick some number of tags divided by level into this item.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which they also seem to be more like chimerical items that look different in mundane form. And I know some treasures are disguised like that or tuned to a single user like this, but it doesn't give a lot of room for like the thing that is obviously a treasure to mortal and fey alike.
Right. Yeah.
So I said that was like last but not least, but the actual last but not least is an appendix on derangements.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's a lot of debate about whether or how to include these in games, but there is a sidebar on sensitivity around mental illness, and the framework makes it less about your character has condition X, which may have social and cultural assumptions baked in, and it just becomes more like a trigger response mechanic.
On the one hand, by decoupling the overt mental illness element, that is more sensitive, I grant you. But on the other hand, by simply devolving it to here's this trigger response mechanic, it also greatly eliminates the intensity and the impact that this profound disconnect from standard reality or standard interaction, it seems to be cheapened.
Yeah, no, I can agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it was sensible, though, that they removed, like, there's no hallucination derangement.
Right.
So, like, a lot of the sort of tropes that people gravitate towards are not really even included here, which...
Mm-hmm. It's much harder to do fishmolks, and that's definitely a good thing.
It's a step forward. It's certainly not the best way.
Right. Yeah, I mean, they gave us the sidebar on sensitivity, but then the rest of the mechanics seems to lack a certain amount of sensitivity. But again, it is a step forward. Yeah. So, cool. Okay, better than nothing.
And then there's a list of backers and a quite well laid out character sheet.
Agreed. I really did like the character sheet. I don't know what it is, but I just really, really appreciate the spot at the bottom for common test pools. Yeah. Such a little thing, but that's beautiful. I really wish other character sheets had that.
A lovely back cover as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And that's the book.
Yeah.
So the glaring holes, no enchantment, and no mortals, really. Like, we have the myths rules, but there's no reference point in terms of mortal stuff. And maybe they just didn't want to deal with figuring that out. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But... And then no dreaming.
No dreaming.
We're told that it exists, but there's no information about trods. There's no oniromancy.
Yeah. You get like 3 paragraphs on the near and deep and far dreaming.
Yeah, with some very minor mechanics thrown in, but...
Yeah, which, okay, if I'm going to go devil's advocate on that, it's really difficult in a LARP setting to portray a major quest into another plane of existence.
Fair enough.
Whether that's the Umbra or the Shadowlands or the Dreaming.
There are references to the Umbra, though, too. So, like in Werewolf, for example, I don't know how they handled it in there, but...
Not terribly well.
Okay.
The Umbra realms got a little bit more treatment, but not enough.
Noted.
But, like, again, when I was doing the playtest, the entirety of the playtest took place in pockets of the Dreaming. And on the one hand, the way it was structured was almost as though the Dreaming had formed these set pieces and your characters fit into those set pieces.
Right.
But that left it entirely up to the storyteller to set design, set decoration, to dress the environment. Like, for example, there was one little scene packet in the playtesting that the Mind's Eye Society was doing for him, where the characters found themselves shrunk down to the size of toys. And they were in a child's backyard, so like the blades of grass are up over their heads, and the little girl is like Nanny from the Muppet Babies cartoon. You can only see her from the knees up. And you're fighting for Morians in the shape of large ants and other toys.
Beautiful.
And that's a perfectly viable dreaming scenario. But there was no insight on how to make that come alive.
Yeah. Just a couple little bonuses to your test pools. Yeah. Maybe that'll be the supplement that we never get.
Yeah. I mean, I'm even talking like in terms of like pure physicality. Like I ended up getting butcher paper and drawing huge blades of grass and lawn furniture and tapping it up on the walls and throwing green netting over the furniture to be ground cover and putting like ant antenna onto a couple of my other players. That was entirely just stuff that I pulled out of my hind end. There was no assistance in terms of how can I make my players really see this.
Yeah. And I'll put on my devil's advocate hat and say, on the one hand, if you're arguing that the setting is endless winter, and you could say, well, it's like in the interregnum, they're mostly cut off from the dreaming. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that they don't even give much narrative around it.
Right.
It would be hard for a player coming into this without any other knowledge to understand why the dreaming even matters to changelings, or why Arcadia matters, or any of that.
Exactly. Without an understanding of what had been in the past, there's no sense of loss. There's no
Exactly.
sense of scarcity as to what is current.
Well, there's also no sense of scarcity because apparently there are freeholds just popping up wherever. So.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which again, like in a small troop game, it doesn't matter. I mean, okay, you've got a freehold. Great. There might not be another freehold for 200 miles.
Right.
And in a small troop game, that's perfectly fine. That doesn't work in a large game.
No. There's not really anything about motleys versus oath circles. Obviously,
right.
Switching courts, who knows?
Yeah, functionally impossible.
Epiphanies don't really matter.
Not really. Nope.
Yeah.
I mean, Epiphany, you can quest for it, but
Yeah. Overall thoughts?
The writers made the game that they wanted to play because they reasonably enough felt that the way they played was the way the game should be played.
Yeah.
And they did a pretty good job of creating the game that they wanted to be played, except that it in no way facilitated or supported all the people who didn't particularly like that playstyle.
Do you have any sense of proportions with that? Like, what percent of LARPers do you think this was what they wanted?
I would say that approximately 40% of the Mind's Eye Society, which again is my only real basis of comparison, about 40% of the players adhered to this play style and found great satisfaction in it. And those 40% of the players tended to be the most vocal on the forums and the mailing lists and the Discord servers, etc.
Oh, aren't they just?
Aren't they just? The remaining 60%, which I note is the majority,
yes,
would prefer another play style, but they didn't have the voice or the out-of-character connections to the important people to make their voices heard. And, well, frankly, it's easier to force that 60% to play the way the 40% wants than to force the 40% to play the way the 60% wants.
Mm. I mean, it's really disappointing to kind of know that as context surrounding it. Because, I mean, my main thing is that this book was so freaking long.
It was.
And dense. And it's like, when I force myself to read through it, as I go through, I'm thinking, well, maybe this is just really gratifying for the people who are into this. And to know that ultimately the majority of the people were not gratified by it,
mm-hmm.
even just within that one group. It's like,
mm-hmm.
I can't imagine LARPers outside that group are even that into it.
Well, and again, I'll go back to it that Changeling is the second largest LARP group out after Vampire.
Yeah.
It's got the second largest fan base, and I would argue that it has the most rabidly loyal fan base, even above Vampire.
Yes.
So a lot of times you're going to get that 60% of the player base that isn't real keen on this new book. But, okay, if this is the book that I have to use to play the game that I love, I'm going to suck it up and do it.
Right.
So they're going to play, and they're going to derive whatever joy they can based off what's given to them.
And what could be more changeling than that?
Honestly? Yeah. And isn't that just a kick in the teeth?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on that uplifting note, we've been talking for a while, so I think it's probably good that we wrap here. And again, thank you so much for bringing your thoughts and sharing all of this, because I am an ignorant when it comes to LARP for Changeling.
Well, thank you for having me, and let me again state that take everything that I've said with a grain of salt. My experience is exclusively from those large, long-running organized play campaigns.
So do you happen to have any kind of presence on the internet or anything, or ways to get in touch with you that you would want to direct people towards?
I'm We're Buffalo on all social media. That's like werewolf, but Buffalo. I'm not entirely sure why someone would want to get in touch with me, but they're welcome to.
To share thoughts. And you're on our Discord, so, you know.
Yes, I am.
Speaking of which, all right, this is the part of the show where I try to go through all the links that Josh usually does. Okay. So if you want to reach out to myself or Josh, or just get in touch with the show as a, freestanding chimerical sentient entity, you can reach out to us on Discord at discord.me/CTP, where much conversation takes place. You can send an email to podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. We are on both Facebook and YouTube at Changeling the Podcast. Our Mastodon is dice.camp/@changelingpod, or however the structure of that works. We're changelingpod on dice.camp through Mastodon. And our Patreon, www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Links to all of these, as well as that essay, as well as the book we've been discussing, will all be in the show notes to this episode. Once again, I've been Pooka.
And I'm still Amanda.
All the world's a stage, and some poor suckers are, getting undone.
Well, they'll just be brought back with Tailcraft.
The expanded system of hand signals in this version of the LARP rules inspires all sorts of additional options that you may wish to use in your game. Beyond raising one hand to show that you're exceptionally imposing, or making claw hands to indicate your obvious monstrosity, consider touching one finger to the center of your forehead to mean, I am having an Arcadia flashback. Put both hands up and twirl them twice anti-clockwise for, I am under a gaze and have no control over my actions, don't hold it against me. Use your middle fingers to pull your eyebrows up if you want to suggest, my character is offended at the ignorance of this suggestion, but for the sake of verisimilitude I will not comment, and so forth. If you have other ideas for gestures to add to this ever-growing canon, do let us know via our Discord at www.discord.me/ctp or through any of the other channels listed in the show notes. Priority for inclusion in our upcoming manual on this topic goes to our patrons, who get a shout-out at the end of each episode like so. Anarchist, Derek, Dorcadus, Ellerus, Ia Bull, Jason Vines, Oreo, Roz Caboose, Sandjigger, Sija, Terry Robinson, Tricerabeth, and Victor Torrey. If you'd like to support the show and join their ranks, visit www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast to sign up. We also appreciate reviews on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience. With that, good night and good luck against the Fomorians, manage your bleed carefully, and keep on dreaming.